This is always a weird list for me to sit down and do. One of my key problems with the game industry right now is the negative cycle that surrounds it. Don't get me wrong, criticism of all the games coming out, that is absolutely necessary, and it's not what I'm talking about. In fact, it's essential for the industry to grow. But what's important at the core of criticism is the why. Why did a game fail? And what could have been done to stop it? Or why a trend is going to hurt the industry in the long run, and understand what could be done moving forward. Without that second action of what it means, all you're doing is, if you're talking about the first of what went wrong, all you're doing is making clickbait news that actually damages things more than it informs. I mean, let's take the smart decision that Nintendo made of informing people about Metroid Prime's 4 restart of development. That's actually very smart. It's opening up the process to everyone, getting people to understand what exactly happened. And it is a breath of fresh air in the industry. This is what we need more of: transparency. So what happens? Well, this happens. I mean, of course it does. Because it's a way for people to make hits, rather than actually help the industry that they supposedly love. Yes, if you haven't figured this out by now, I hate this shit. And I know that it's the algorithm. But have some self-respect for the hobby you love, goddammit. So, rather than say that X game is the worst game of 2018, or X game is the biggest disappointment of the year, I'd rather focus on themes. Themes that, yes, certain games will highlight the theme's problems, but they are more a factor of the trend. Now, a couple things. This list is a relative list. What I mean by that is that I'm looking for the gain and loss of trends that have happened over the year. If a trend is bad, but didn't really gain a whole lot of traction during the year, even going down in some cases, then it may not make this list. But if it did gain a lot, it's probably higher up. So, let's get into the details. These are my top gaming disappointment trends of 2018. Number 11. Zombies. What's funny here is that by the time this video goes up and is live, the Resident Evil 2 remake has probably made zombies popular again. But you may have forgotten that a number of zombie games came out in 2018, and none of them made any sort of splash in the genre. State of Decay 2 wasn't horrible, but it scored a 69 on Metacritic and didn't exactly blow anyone away. Overkill's The Walking Dead bombed with everyone, unable to live up to the legacy of Payday 2, and turned in absolutely mind-numbing in the gameplay in its later stages. Speaking of The Walking Dead, Telltale's last season almost didn't come out thanks to the problems with Telltale, which, yes, will be hit on later in this list. Even with that said, it hasn't felt like the brilliantly narrative design of the first season of the game. It just really feels like Clementine's story is going out on an okay note in the final season, but not the bar the first season set. Finally, there's Metal Gear Survive, and of course it would be on this list. What more fun could you have than poking crystal zombies for an hour, over and over again? Now, is it just bad gameplay here? Is it lazy storytelling? Or are we as gamers finally past zombies? Well, considering I just said that the Resident Evil 2 remake had made them popular again, it doesn't seem like the third one. But the thing is, just having them in your game isn't going to draw the types of fans that it did 5 to 8 years ago. There's too many good games out there, and you have to focus on quality more than anything else, but in particular, you need a unique twist to make it stand out from your brothers in the genre. Like having a giant man in a trench coat follow you around mercilessly, scaring the crap out of you at every turn. You need these kind of moments the ones that make the experience punch you in the jaw and say, play me. Because right now, zombies themselves just don't do enough for people to want to give your game the time of day. Number 10. Chopping up the cow. If you didn't know this channel, you probably would think that this would have been number 1 on the list. Now, unlike others, I'm not necessarily against the ideas of microtransactions in general. The industry has not moved up the price of main games for a while now, despite rising development costs and needing more workers in their projects. And there are times where I do think that, yes, microtransactions are not only a necessity, but are fairly implemented and have pushed gaming further and evolved the gaming scene. With that said, there are good ways to do microtransactions, and there are bad ways to do microtransactions. Sure, unlockable cosmetics have existed in games before microtransactions, but it felt like with updates down the road and new assets to add thanks to new services, that microtransactions in multiplayer games like Fortnite seem reasonable to offset server costs and keep development going, especially with free-to-play models. But we're getting to the point where the transactions themselves are going a little bit too deep in the pocketbook in certain situations for what you're actually getting. When looking at a game like Fallout 76 and how much they want for simple furniture in the game, assets that haven't exactly earned a $10 price tag, you start to wonder what's going on. Then you see things like reticules for Black Ops 4 being sold for $1 or so, even when they were present in other games as free, and you start to wonder why you're paying for a dot on the screen. That's not even going into gambling mechanics that are a whole different subject, that are seemingly even ramping up more in mobile games, well, at least the ones that are not being hit by legislation. The worst scenario I see, however, are things like Metal Gear Survive, and a second save slot costing $5. I mean, some games in the past have had only one save slot, but that usually was because of a memory limitation. The fact that Konami wanted to charge more money for a simple ability to play the game a different way without restarting, not really changing the core experience of the game, is absurd. It'd be like requiring you to pay more money to switch out your music on your phone in my eyes. It's just, you're paying for something that you already have. The evolution of these transactions is what makes the list, and frankly, I am sort of worried in which way they will go next. Now, with that said, you're probably wondering why this is so low on the list, and it's because of one thing. There's actually a big positive that could evolve from it thanks to, of all people, Activision. See, what did I just say in the paragraphs before? That the division of content that you were expected to pay for in the past seemed to be getting new price tags on it. But if the division of that content also came with price divisions itself, aka if you were to buy parts of games or sections of games for a lower price that you wanted to play only that section, that could be a great thing for the industry. Now, I know that episodic gaming is sort of like that, but this is a little bit different. Take Black Ops 4 and the division of the Blackout mode being able to be bought by itself. I myself have bought Call of Duties in the past just for the zombies portion, but the fact that they are willing to divide their game and let people buy parts of it, that could be good for the consumer in the future if more publishers follow that step, getting what they want, but not necessarily paying for anything more than that. But if it's going to be just chopping up parts that don't make sense to put additional fees on things, we're going to have more problems moving forward. Number 9. Switch ports. Remember a couple of years ago that it was supposed to be the death of Nintendo as a console publisher? that the Nintendo Switch was going to bomb. Who would buy a console that came apart like it did? Funny how you look back on situations like that and just sort of laugh. The success of the console can be attributed to a variety of things, but one specific that I will point to is the quality of the third-party ports. Games like Axiom Verge, Stardew Valley, and Darkest Dungeon allow to play those quality games on the go at high performance, and it stands out compared to everything else in the industry. They may be a tiny step down, but for the portability portion, that's worth it. So, like many trends and the sales that came with those ports, many developers and publishers followed these games to put their products on the Switch. And then we saw some of the worst ports that we've ever seen on the device this year. Now, none of these are the biggest games, but the one that is the most recognizable is Ark Survival Evolved. But I actually sort of don't want to include it because, well, its performance on other platforms isn't exactly stellar either. But you could see what you see on the screen right now and realize that, yeah, it's not really reasonable. But beyond that, there's also Hello Neighbor, which was also ported to the iOS. The Nintendo Switch version graphics look atrocious compared to other platforms, and while they probably did that to get an okay frame rate, it's sort of hilarious, as why would you want to play on the Switch as opposed to, well, I don't know, the iOS? In addition, the game did have reasonable bugs and physics problems on the platform, and you'd think that the touch functionality would have been there considering the iOS version had it. But it doesn't. It doesn't use any Switch-specific functionality. There's the port of Payday 2 as well, which released at a measly 20 FPS at the time, and that is not going to do for an FPS game. You want 60, but even 30 is pushing it. But 20? Really? 20? If you look around, there's a reasonable dumping ground of ports on the Switch, and they are all over the place in the quality portion, some of them hitting dumpster level quality. I am somewhat concerned here for the future despite some quality ones, because a lot of these games end up actually doing rather well, or at least the smaller ones do, mostly because the developers make the game so cheap, like the horror game Hollow, which performed as well as Cody Parkey did in the Chicago Bears season. As a Bears fan, don't say I can't ever take a joke. But that game did alright, mostly because it was $2. But hopefully, Nintendo will start getting a little bit more strict with performance on its console, because I really don't want to see a quality freefall on the store. Number 8. Failing to understand your audience. I'm going to admit something here. The whole controversy regarding Battlefield 5, I know that there were many problems here for many players, for those who liked social justice, for those who felt like the game was going a little bit too far in the social justice angle. But man, did this feel like it got way out of hand. However, the core problem that existed here, regardless of how overblown the controversy was from my perspective, is simple. That the expectations of the audience of the franchise and what EA gave them marketing-wise did not match up. That seemed to be present more and more this year, and in particular, not understanding the audience in the setting that you're presenting it in. That seemed to be more and more present this year, even in less controversial situations. I mean, just look at the Diablo Immortal reveal. Now, here's the thing. You've got thousands of PC gamers in one place, having grown up on the PC and having LANs, and making many friends online and probably meeting them there. They feel like they are usually overlooked, but they are willing to support a company who fights for them. People who make Diablo 3 despite some problems on launch. People who make Overwatch. In front of them, you don't introduce a game along that line for those type of people, but you introduce a game that takes one of their beloved franchises, the Diablo franchise, and creates a game that feels like it's more of what the mobile market and the casual market want. The thing is, this could have worked right in the right circumstances. If you said that you were working on Diablo 4, or didn't put it at the end of your conference as the last bullet in your gun. But you ended the big reveals with that. And then, on top of that, you didn't have the right PR people to take on questions when a person asked if it was an early April Fool's joke. Which, by the way, that could have been a reference to an actual April Fool's joke that Diablo made. Which, by the way, also, don't give this guy shit like I've seen people do. He's a dev, and it's on Blizzard that they used a dev and not a PR guy that was put into a shit situation that he obviously wasn't trained for and tried to use humor to get out of it. But beyond that, there's also these middling cases. Take Just Cause 4. Just Cause 4 feels like it's very focused on one subset of people, the stunt and sandbox group of gamers. But if you look at the advertising and the way it was presented as just another Just Cause game, despite there being huge differences with how many explosions there were, how many buildings you could tear down, and the general structure of the game. It is hard for me, however, to put this higher on the list, because there were plenty of cases this year where the vocal actors go against what they say they want with their purchasing patterns, and sometimes the publishers were perfectly right in their perception. Games like Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu did find their audience despite the fact that some people thought, oh, it's just another Pokemon game that's dumbed down, it's for the kiddies. And yet, some real Pokemon fans, some really hardcore Pokemon fans, still enjoyed the game. Now, of course, there's always going to be a different opinion, whether or not, you change the hardcore elements of it, whether or not it feels streamlined, but I do feel like in many cases, the publisher does have an idea of what the public wants because, well, they are trying to sell a product to them, and sometimes it's best to give what the customer wants. But this year, I do feel like that perception is slipping just a tiny bit. And that's gotta stop before it becomes too large. Number 7. Advertising and anti-advertising. Okay, we all know that sometimes advertising can overblow some elements of what you're going to buy out of the water. I mean, yes, it's natural to hype up your product and say it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and it's going to change the world. I mean, you're trying to sell a product. Of course, there's going to be situations that it fails to deliver, but it may have been true in terms of what the goal was. That fact is, that kind of success, that kind of advertising can be subjective at times. And it does sometimes succeed, even if it ends up not hitting the lofty goals. But this year, it felt like more and more that what you were promised and what you actually got was a whole different thing. Specifically at the lower level detail of what advertising was telling you. You knew that Fallout 76 was going to show up in this video. Do I really have to re-hit the points about that online experience? I mean, I could point to the game and say how buggy it was, how the game still has major problems right now. And the fact is that they seem to be reintroducing problems that were fixed before. But I could also point to how the dynamic gameplay and crafting systems had major flaws in them that didn't show what the major problems with the game were going to be, and how a move to an online space didn't fit the Fallout franchise at all. That Todd Howard, once again, as the public face of the company, overhyped his game at the latest game conferences. But what I want to focus on more in this element were the other elements that came with it. When canvas bags, specifically referred to as canvas bags, were promised, and they were nylon instead. Sure, we've seen bad collector's editions in the past with Marvel vs. Capcom's Infinity Eggs and Dark Souls Estus Flask, but this seemed to be a ramp up of those. It didn't specifically say this product or this type of item, but here it did. Then, not understanding why the backlash happened from the Fallout 76 PR standpoint, and then just adding fuel to the fire. There's also the Nuka Dark Rum incident, where the $100 bottle wasn't presented to be plastic in its advertising, and people felt like they were cheated, that they overpaid for the product. Which, yes, the reaction from the company who made it was a little better this time, but all these elements added up to the fact that Bethesda, one of the golden boys of the industry almost a year ago, had really shortened its reputation in one go. That's sort of scary. But beyond the big obvious target here, there were other examples of this all over the industry, in particular focusing on the games themselves. Sea of Thieves launched, but it felt dead. Like half the game was missing, as many people noted that there wasn't a lot to do and that it got repetitive rather fast. There's Atlas, which people found out was a relatively reskinned Ark, which Atlas didn't necessarily say it was too different, but it did seem to indicate that major changes were made, and people didn't seem to believe that very well when Ark portions were showing up in menus. Now, like I said, this isn't new for the industry, but here's the thing. This year introduced something else. The other side of the coin. When advertising has been done right, and yet because of all the incidents of the past, that people assume the worst. There's this idea that because something happened in the past, that we must do everything to stop it now, and that's true. Learning from your mistakes is important. But don't get me wrong, you have to recognize the circumstances that caused the situations of the past, and if they apply to the current one. A group of people got up in arms due to a perceived graphical downgrade of Spider-Man on the PS4, referred to as Puddlegate. Those people were so concerned with situations like the bullshot of Killzone 2 that this was going to happen again. The problem is they didn't take anything into account, like the dynamic weather system, or the history of the studio, or even looked closely to realize that the quality really hadn't gone down. It was shifted in certain areas, but it was still there. But no, it was huge news and got people fighting. You were getting what you paid for here and did what the developer had promised. But we were in such a rush to assume bad that no one stopped to think, wait, what am I yelling about? This is sowing distrust left and right, and I only hope that developers and publishers do the one thing and one thing only to fix this problem. Communicate more. Seriously, communicate more and answer questions about what's going on. You will be surprised how this would have fixed 90% of the problems here. There are always going to be situations that it won't fix. There will always be that vocal minority that will be upset no matter what you do. But for the people in the middle, the 90% who are understanding, yeah, they will appreciate it. And they will understand when you have to make decisions based off of, finances, or, understand that, what you see isn't exactly the situation that you're going to get. Just communicate more, guys. It's not that hard. Number 6. Not letting sleeping dogs lie. Sometimes a franchise deserves to stay buried. Sure, I would love another Mischief Makers and would jump up and down in front of anyone who can make it happen. But I also know that I would want only certain development teams to touch it, because things could go poorly even with a talented development team. Now, it'd be very easy to say that some of the biggest franchises of the last year, franchises like Battlefield and Metal Gear, ended up with games that looked poorly in its history. And I could leave it at that. But what surprised me this year was the next set of games of franchises long past that ended up falling flat on their face despite some talent behind those teams. Dynasty Warriors 9 is made by the same team that did other Dynasty Warrior games and just moved it to the open world. By doing so, completely undid some of the smart strategy elements of the Musou genre and ended up making a game that felt tedious and uninspired. Then there's Fear Effect Sanaya, based on the really underrated Fear Effect series that focused on an interesting atmosphere and pushed boundaries in expression. And it ended up being somewhat bland and uninteresting this time around, despite trying gameplay mechanics that were very hit and miss with players. Then there's the new Gundam Breaker, which somehow regressed gameplay-wise horribly from games before, and decided to cut out mechanics core to the enjoyment, like specializing your new Gundam down to the smallest detail. But you know what? At least those games had histories in which it made sense to bring them around to try again. For some god-awful reason, Shaq-Fu, A Legend Reborn, followed up, in my opinion, worse than its predecessor. The shock humor only goes so far when you keep on self-referencing your laziness in your coding, and when your beat-em-up has as much variety as a middle school kitchen on a Wednesday, yeah, you're probably going to have a bad game. It doesn't help that the game throws advertisements in your face for things like Icy Hot, and this could all be forgiven if the mechanics were more than punch dudes over and over again without any sort of challenge. Nothing about the game was redeemable, and I know for some odd and strange reason people seem to like it. Maybe it's the fact that watching someone play through this game and torture themselves has a little bit of fun to it, I guess. But for those people, I do question whether or not you have sadist tendencies, because for me, this game was awful. But you're probably saying, what's the fix, Dragnix? Well, honestly, it's understanding the core of the franchise a little better. You could change elements of a game and still be effective. Take things like Hyrule Warriors, and you could spin games into successful elements as long as you keep the core of the franchise in place. In many of these cases, the developers missed what the true core of their franchise was, and why people were drawn to it and it specifically, despite those previous games having significant flaws. But because they missed why people were drawn to it, they failed. If you're going to use the name, you've got to understand what it means. Except for Shaq-Fu. That game shouldn't have existed. At least we know that there's no games this year that will fall into that category. No games. None. Zero. Zip. This doesn't exist. I don't care what you say. I am not playing. I'm going to end up playing this game this year, aren't I? Oh, for... Number 5. A house divided cannot play. One of the things that I always emphasize on this channel is that games are a sum of parts. That the best games have elements that support each other in the best way. In fact, take Wondersong. Wondersong's singing mechanic works well with its immersive story. Even if itself isn't the greatest of mechanics when looked inside a box, its sole purpose of helping with immersion fits perfectly for the game and the story it's trying to tell. And that's the point. It's designed so that you don't have excess in certain areas, that one key part doesn't drag you down, but the effort you put into the bigger parts are highlighted by it, and thus everything works masterfully. 2018, however, several games that would have ended up on my worst games of the year list fell into this category, with having either one feature that stood out so poorly to drag everything else down, or had too many features that clashed with each other and took the whole house down. Take Agony, for example, which on the surface is my kind of game. A story-driven experience, and while yes, it had minimal gameplay elements, the dark and brooding nature of it could have really worked if it didn't perform like a 1995 Dodge Neon with 250,000 miles. Even on really low settings, it took away from the presentation because, well, I got sick watching it and how bad the performance was. I couldn't focus on the story, I was just trying to not puke. But the better example, and the one I'd like to highlight, is Mother Gunship. Mother Gunship has some elements that are great. The weapon system is fun to create new powerful weapons in, and each system has its strengths when it comes to the speed of combat or the enemy variety. But the package coming together exposed major flaws, like how speedy you were didn't help when the sound design didn't give you good enough clues so that you ran into an enemy that you didn't see behind you, or how the game would spawn enemies on top of you with really no remorse, and sometimes you were too fast to get out of the way. It then nosedived with one really dumb decision at the end of the game to put you in a gauntlet situation of beating 7 levels in a row. And when the game's other flaws made you lose repeatedly due to some BS enemy placement or just bad luck without feeling like you could overcome it, it drove itself into a non-recommendable state despite having some real effort and some shine to it. Now, this is a hard problem to solve because, well, it's all about game design mechanics, and my recommendation for developers out there, get feedback early. Don't go down a path before you can turn around. In many of these cases that I've seen this year, it was a fundamental game design flaw that could have been avoided. Because I felt like in this year, many of these games also realized their faults, try to get around them in other ways, but they couldn't because the base design was faulty. Take your time in design and documentation. You'll be glad you did. Number 4. The fear of perception. Because video games have gotten so influential in the sphere of media, we're starting to get a whole new sense of fear-mongering that comes from what backlash that they could cause. Of course, we've seen these situations in the past. I mean, situations like the violent video games era of the Columbine shootings, and that for some reason came back this year via the White House. Moral panic aside, what I want to focus on is more the lower key stuff. The self-censorship, the publisher censorship, or the platform censorship. Because it feels like, especially in the latter half of 2018, that started to really become a major issue. Now, I understand I'm using the word censorship here, and I do that lightly. The fact is that these guys, they own their own content to publish on their platforms, and it's their decision to make whether or not to publish it. But I question whether or not they are making the right decision based on this fear, this perception of negative media attention coming to a platform or a publisher. There is a new renewed element of sexual censorship on Sony platforms right now against games like the Senran Kagura series, with Sony asking Marvelous Entertainment to remove modes like the Intimate mode out of their game for their platform. Now, it's still available for Steam, so at least you got that. But beyond that, we're hearing that a bunch of devs are now running into problems on the Japanese visual novel side that they've never seen these responses from Sony before, asking for sexual elements to be removed from their games. Now, there's rumors about why this is the case, even so far as going to blame the 2020 Olympics. But here's the thing, Nintendo is more open than ever, allowing games like Galgun 2 on their platform. And they were the family-friendly face that you would expect the kind of censorship from, but you understood it. It wasn't necessarily their niche. Even Valve, who have said that they are not censorship police, are starting to get a little bit inconsistent with some of the games they are disapproving due to the minors element of them. Now, in some cases, I can understand it, but there have been some cases that have come up that the game, despite having minors in it, it doesn't really make sense of why they are actually disapproving it. Where I really get concerned, however, is how this could affect the actual development of games going forward. Take things like The Witch and the 100 Knight 2. I felt like the story was purposely toned down due to the backlash that the original game had regarding Metalia, and how dark she was, how that she wasn't holding anything back. Reviews were brutal on the game for it being sick, or at least some of them were, despite there being good story development on why she was like that, and it explored themes that not a lot of games were willing to take a look at. But all I could think of during my gameplay of 100 Night 2 was that someone told the devs that they had to tone it down, that they tried to do something different because they were told that, and it missed. It wants to be more provocative, you see that in some of the writing, and it seems like it's ready to burst out of its shell, and it just can't. And that's probably because it feared the backlash, and that's where things get scary. That's what's scary to me. You can change things for specific audience to better your sales and all, but I feel like with a growing average age of gamers, that you would be willing to even go darker or take more risks on stories like this. But alas, that's not what seems to be happening in a lot of cases. The moral panic at times takes control. Number 3. The mysterious algorithm. I know it's very easy to dunk on the ideas of algorithms if you don't know exactly what they are, and that's on both sides of the equation. They are this mysterious entity that YouTubers curse, that indie developers fight against to get attention when they are overlooked. Now, you may not know this, but they're all over the place even in the non-computing world, even in your daily life. Usually, however, the lack of knowledge surrounding them can be a real hassle to deal with, trying to explain to people that no, it's not as easy as throwing a few lines of code in the back end to try to get a more balanced playing field. The fact is, the bigger and more diverse set of data, the more complicated the algorithm could be, but at the same time, it may be even harder to figure out the side effects of that algorithm. But that's the thing you've got to also understand as a creator of a product. You may have no idea how your algorithm has propagated, and you have to not make assumptions about everything working well. Sure, some of the complaints that people may attribute to an algorithm may be them just bitching, or it could be that you are going in an entirely new direction with your product. It may be purposeful, despite the fact that you don't indicate that to the players. And while that sucks, sometimes it is the right call to not publish that publicly, because then people start gaming the system, dirtying the data, and then you don't have any sort of effects that you actually want. This year, however, the algorithm reared its ugly head in a lot of different situations. Let's take the case of Wondersong, where the algorithm decided that it wasn't a real game, not allowing it access to reasonable features that help Steam games flourish. Those like trading cards and achievements. Yes, they mean a lot to players, and if they're not there, some people will overlook a game. Now Valve, responding on 2 separate occasions to the Wondersong developers, indicated that no, everything was working fine and it was just the algorithm that was the problem. Only for the 3rd time to reveal that yes, their game Wondersong was incorrectly categorized as a fake game of sorts, and thus they didn't get the features that could have helped them. And considering that was my overlooked game of the year, yeah, I'm a little bit ticked at Valve on this situation. If you looked at the game in a manual sort of way, if somebody from their backend just looked at the quality of the reviews on the Steam store page, they would have realized that, hey, wait a minute, those abnormally positive reviews, they weren't fake. People put their heart and soul into some of these reviews, and it showed. So it just took a minute for a human to look at it to say, hey, this is a real game. Now, I know that there are going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 situations that are on the opposite side of this one that say, oh yeah, something's wrong, my game is not fake, only for, yeah, no, your game is fake, you've got bot reviews, stuff like that. But that doesn't mean you don't look at the actual data and make a decision about it based off of these reports. There's this weird mentality to not admit mistakes nowadays, or to assume that everything is working fine, and Valve has been one of the worst offenders in this time. And it leads to my other biggest offender this year when it comes to the algorithm, YouTube. Now, I understand that YouTube isn't specifically gaming, but you have to understand, YouTube is ingrained into gaming culture right now. I mean, if you think a game is going to be good, you may go to YouTube to look at some gameplay. You may come here for a review. Hell, I do all these videos on YouTube, so yeah, of course it's going to be a place to get some information. But with that said, this year has been pretty bad for gaming YouTube. Not only for creators who have been fighting the algorithm, but there are other elements of the algorithm that have really come into focus this year. Spoilers for one. The thing is about spoilers is that yes, they're going to happen, but when I go to YouTube and I look for God of War PS4 review, what I shouldn't be expecting is huge spoilers to show up on their page. Now, yes, the way that the data works right now, you're not going to be able to avoid that if people abuse tags. Hint, YouTube, you need to punish tag abuse a little bit more. Another good example of this is what happened with MatPat and Heartbound and the developer Grounded. The stream in question that showed off the game used tags like Undertale and Deltarune, even though the game wasn't inspired by those games at all, but it was a good question. Did these tags matter? Did these tags make sense considering the game felt like a Deltarune Undertale experience? People may point out to me, wait a minute, Dragnix, that was in 2019, how can you count in 2018? Well, that problem actually existed pretty much everywhere, especially in the indie market. People abusing tags so that they can get, #1 on the algorithm or be able to be high on the algorithm, but I felt like that was the primary example to use to show that behavior. It happened to games like Mid-Boss and it happened to other games like it, but yeah, I use that example because it's probably the most representative and maybe still fresh in people's mind. Part of the problem here is that with the algorithm, it needs more data, and if you don't get very specific with that data, it's not going to work. And unfortunately, YouTube doesn't do specifics very well. I mean, look at the whole community guidelines thing. The solution to this problem, however, in many cases, is a little bit of curation and a little bit more of support. Giving that information and getting that information from the end users to apply to the situation and to help refine your algorithm is a huge part of data collection, of data mining, and of understanding what your audience is. It feels like a lot of these bigger services, the Amazons, the YouTubes, the Valves, they want to use automated processes more. And it is great that you want to do that, but you have to understand the manual elements of it so that you can get to that point. Because if you don't, you end up having these situations where games aren't recommended when they should be, and vice versa. And unfortunately, that can affect people so much that they're not able to make a living off of it, even though you told them that they could. Number 2. The unseen workforce and their treatment. I know, this isn't new in the gaming world. It's one of the reasons that even though I'm a software engineer and I love video games to my core, I don't look for jobs in the gaming world. It's a harsh place with a lot of competition on the software engineering side, and it's willing to dump you at a moment's notice due to budgets and bottom lines despite the quality of your work. The fact of the matter is that I want a little bit more than just doing games all my life, and unfortunately, the indie industry can be brutal, and sometimes it's really hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And this year there were a lot of studio closures. Boss Key Productions, Capcom Vancouver, but none this year. None even came close to the absolute travesty that was the closure of Telltale Games. What happened to the Telltale employees is abhorrent and needs to be addressed in the industry now. Hell, the working conditions in general need to actually be addressed. Not only did these employees not get any sort of severance and had their health insurance taken away almost 2 weeks after the studio went down, but Telltale was not even able to fulfill the legal obligations that the laws of California were set up to give them. And if you can't even rely on that, you've got a major, major problem. Now, you can argue that the company Telltale didn't create good games lately, that you knew it was coming, and it sucks that one of the core studios that caused a revolution in storytelling closed, but it had to happen. And you know what? I do agree with you to a certain extent. With the content they were creating, they just didn't have enough to keep the studio open. But you also don't need to screw with your employees like that. From what we've heard, they tried to get funding that they needed, but weren't transparent at all of informing the employees of the risks that they were going through, that they may not have the money to pay them the next week. Overnight, hundreds of employees were let go into the wild, even ones who had started a week earlier, who flew across the country, resettled in a new city, only to now have everything torn from them. This wasn't a situation where something huge came up out of nowhere and they were screwed. They knew this was coming and they didn't do anything to stop it. Well, anything in terms of informing of the negative possibilities. People have talked about video game unions starting up to protect the industry assets. And honestly, I'm not sure if that's entirely the solution, but something does need to happen here in my opinion. Competition is big in the industry, and frankly, yes, not everyone is going to succeed. There are those people who work their butts off that may have not worked hard as others out there, but they still have worked their butts off. I get that the passionate are supposed to make it, that they're supposed to use their passion to get to the top, and evolution happens, and some companies won't make it in the end. But basic human decency has to happen too. And if we can't give basics like you may be out of a job in 2 weeks, or even hint at what the true story behind the development is, we're in trouble. Real personal trouble. Number 1. The damage to experimental games. This was caused by one game, and one game alone. Before you say anything, yes, I understand that my whole intro to this list was to dissuade you of the idea of focusing on one game and bashing it to pieces. Yes, I sort of misdirected you on the last point of this list in terms of the fact that it really will be focusing on one game. But I really don't think that people understand the implications of the damage that The Quiet Man may have done to the industry as a whole. It is undoubtedly the worst game of the year, and people may try to write it off as another Alone in the Dark Illumination or a Sonic Boom, that it's a bad game, but we'll move on from it. But those people don't understand the larger gaming industry as a whole, in particular, the AAA and AA studios. Experimental games are not those studios' forte. Sure, you will get situations where developers and publishers will mess with core elements of their franchise to change things up, but they play it safer than a lot of other mediums out there. I mean, Breath of the Wild, despite going open world, was still a Zelda game at its core. But when it comes to really putting their necks on the line with a real risk, it rarely happens, even at a smaller project level. All those publishers usually want some smaller company to take that risk and do it first. Even with more experimental games at the time from the AAA industry such as Life is Strange, another company in Telltale came before that to try it first, and only when it was shown to be a success did publishers like Square Enix get involved. Which leads me to The Quiet Man. Never had a AAA game done something so out there as release a game without major elements of sound. To try to capture the feeling and roadblocks for a handicapped person, specifically to simulate the experience of a deaf protagonist. In the AAA game industry, I can't think of one attempt even close to that. And really, when you think about it, the idea in itself could have been really fascinating. If done right, it could have opened doors to a lot of different experiences regarding maybe color blindness, regarding storytelling, regarding inclusivity, helping people experience those other worlds, and maybe not only teaching them something, but actually making them look at life differently. Sure, there have been indie games that have done it. Games like Sim and Anxiety Disorder are the prime example. But this was a AAA game. A big publisher in Square Enix was on it. It would have the power to maybe change people's perception. But Square Enix failed to actually really quality check their game before, and should never had released this game in the state that it came out in. I'm not saying that QA didn't do their job here. They might have told their bosses that there's no way that this game is going to do well and that it needs more time, or to cancel the project. But the fact is, the game was pushed out for sale, and that is an abomination, as it failed in everything it tried to do. And the thing is, that's not even reasonably interpretable. Yeah, some say that things can be bad in certain situations, that others can say it's good. But this one, no. Everything was horrible. The familiar parts of the game based on the other parts of the industry were horribly buggy and frankly boring. You weren't going to get people into your game like that. And a broken combat system that put you to sleep? I mean, come on. Now the visuals were fine, but some bad acting in parts really screwed with the visual storytelling. You know, the thing that you really have to rely on in a deaf protagonist? Now the reveal of showing the sound after you play the game was also horribly done. In fact, it made things even worse, showing that the visual storytelling actually contradicted the actions of the characters. You felt like you were cheated, that the story was pulled out of nowhere. I mean, the only thing that's really redeemable about the game, besides some okay shots, is the fact that it is a tool to prove to people and to show people that, yeah, this is not how you make a game like this. But what scares me is, like I said, this industry in the AAA and AA part is one that mimics each other. So, many of those big publishers, the Activisions, the Ubisofts, the EAs, they'll look at this game's failure and write off any pitches similar to that. This game may have set back experimental storytelling years, hell, maybe even a decade for how bad it was. Not only was it a commercial failure, the fact is it was panned across the board, and no one is gonna touch this with a 10-foot pole. If you don't believe me, think about one genre that is popular right now: Battle Royale. Think about how many games, even AAA established franchises, ended up putting Battle Royale elements into their game. CSGO, Call of Duty, Battlefield, they all added them. Remember years ago when it was Ubisoft's success in open world games, where everyone wanted to be an open world game? This industry is always chasing trends. And while those games are on the popular side of things, they will also avoid risks like the plague, even though that they may have the resources to make it work. It's just too much of a risk. So, I don't see any alternative story games like The Quiet Man happening in the main AAA scene. That sucks. The boundaries of the medium need to be pushed to evolve. And well, frankly, The Quiet Man may have silenced storytelling evolution. Anyway, that's it for this list. Now, I'm going to be on a little bit of a vacation over the next 5 days after this video comes out with the girlfriend in town. So, even though the content hasn't exactly been flying off the shelves, things will slow down a little bit. I am still working on the top 15 gameplay games and story games of 2018. I do a lot of research, guys. I hope you understand that why it's taking so long. Anyway, I had a giveaway last video, and thus, here are the people who won. Again, you have to do specific things. Join the Discord, that's in the description below. But, once again, we will have a giveaway this time around of these games on the screen. How do you enter? Well, simple. Leave a comment of what has been your most disappointing thing in gaming this year, or something that's maybe not on the list, but something that really has bothered you of 2018. And again, I would love you guys to make comments. How can I make these videos better? So on and so forth. I won't ask you to subscribe or like or anything like that. I just want to make these videos better. Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out for now. I know this video may have seemed a little bit awkward in terms of my voice, in terms of my writing. I did rush things a little bit, but for now, keep on gaming.